Okay, let's go ahead and jump back into it. Welcome back to Foundations. Welcome back to Beyond Foundations. My name is Dean VanEvery, the associate pastor here at Grand Avenue Baptist Church. So this is our the last of the kind of re-recorded lessons for Foundations that I've been circling back through and doing. If you remember, I kind of explained in I think it was the Genesis lesson. Originally, these lessons weren't recorded. These lessons, I just kind of did them live, and that was it. We started recording them in the next one, which I believe was Samuel, the first and second Samuel, should be. So these are, I've been re-recording these, working back through the earlier lessons, and so a couple of there's pros and cons to that as I've been working through this. The pro, I think, is just I've been able to kind of bring some more a little bit more reflection on the rest of the Old Testament back into some of these earlier lessons, which I think has added just a little bit more kind of cohesion and some depth to them, which I think is helpful. But kind of on the negative side, there was. I was just coming in hot out of being researching these things much more deeply back when I was doing them live. So I've been thumbing back through my notes and looking back through some things and rereading some things. But basically I'm just working from my notes that I had almost a year ago by now. So anyways, take it or leave it, take it for what it is. These are just kind of, this is, again, it's the last of the re-recorded. So this next one, if you're working your way through them in order, the next one you're gonna get to is the original live recording. So you have that to look forward to, I suppose. Anyway, so this is Joshua and Judges. We're gonna cover Joshua and Judges. This is the first books after the Pentateuch. So the Pentateuch is just Greek for 5 books. So the Pentateuch is the 5 books of Moses, and then Joshua takes over from Moses as the leader of the nation of Israel at the very end of Deuteronomy. And so then Joshua picks up with Joshua, kind of tells his story, how the Lord uses Joshua to lead the people into the land of Israel, the land of Canaan. So quick, just overview of what we're doing here. So the Old Testament, the purpose of the Old Testament is the same as the purpose of the New Testament. These aren't two kind of unrelated bodies of literature. What the Old Testament is doing, the New Testament is fulfilling. So the Old Testament is bringing you to the New Testament. The Old Testament is setting up and giving the foundation and groundwork of the New Testament. So what is the whole Bible about, and what is the Old Testament about? The Old Testament is about God reconciling all things to himself through the cross of Jesus Christ. The Old Testament is about God reconciling all things to himself through the cross of Jesus Christ. In chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, we see sin enter the world through Adam and Eve's disobedience. We see the serpent deceiving Eve, who then brings Adam into it. And so we see sin enter the world there in chapter 3 of the whole book. And so there we see global curse, where God in judgment, as consequence of sin, curses the whole world through our disobedience, through the disobedience of the human race. And so then what the rest of the Bible is about is God, through his son Jesus Christ, undoing and replacing global curse with global blessing. We see global curse, and then we see in the rest of Genesis global blessing promised. So this gets picked up right away in Genesis, and so there we kind of see basically this kind of threefold or 3-part promise that God gives. First, really clearly to Abraham. It gets hinted at even at the beginning. It's hinted at to Adam, and so there's so even with Adam and Eve, even with the line from Adam to Abraham, there's faith in God, faith in God's Messiah. But it's really clear with Abraham, where God he promises basically this threefold promise. He promises he's going to make Abraham great. He's going to make him a great nation. That's part 1. And then part 2, that Abraham and his people, his nation, is going to flourish in the land. Especially through their obedience to the Lord, they're going to flourish in the land that God gives them. And then 3, through them, through that nation, God is going to bring about global blessing. God is going to undo global curse with global blessing. So there's this promise of being a great nation. There's promise of possessing and flourishing in the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. And then 3, this promise to be a blessing to the whole world. And so really the story of the Old Testament kind of works that out, how has that blessing and that blessed and covenant people, how has their reception of those promises played out? How has God been working in and through their faith and their disobedience, and kind of as they've been in tension? So the rest of the Old Testament is a story. The rest of the Bible is a story of that promise. working its way out to bring about that global blessing. So this is the Old Testament. This is kind of where the story that Joshua and Judges picks up in, and really Joshua and Judges is kind of the one of the major transition points, one of the major transition kind of seams in the Bible. So at the very beginning of Joshua, the people of Israel are not yet in the Promised Land. They're not yet in Israel, and so by the end of Judges, the people have been in the Promised Land for a handful of generations, and so it's kind of transitions from the exile generation into really just about on the cusp of setting up the monarchy with Saul and then David. But we'll get to that in the next couple of lessons. So just before jumping into these two books, I think these are difficult books. These are challenging books. I'm not necessarily so much a kind of intellectually challenging. More so, they're just heavy books. They're weighty books. So these are often a lot of kind of the is God really good if He would allow X, Y, and Z, especially pointing to things in the Bible. Often the kind of those objections are going to find themselves pointing at one of these two books. They're going to find themselves pointing at something from Joshua, something from Judges. There's a lot of content in here that, let's just say, children's Bibles tend to skip over. Have several different versions of kind of quick story Bibles to read to my kids, and they often will mention some things from these chapters, but often kind of skips over the bulk of them, and with good reason. I think these are things that are understandable that you wouldn't want to draw in a way that you'd present to a 4-year-old. But anyways, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time really digging into and addressing kind of some of those difficulties, but I want to give a few comments just on the front end. So first off, if you're reading these books and you find something that you're going, wow, this is hard. This is hard to wrestle with. This is somewhat disturbing. First off, that's not entirely inappropriate. It's not entirely inappropriate to be feeling those things. Second, I'd encourage you to go talk to somebody, especially if you're at our church. Come and talk to one of the elders. Come talk to one of the pastors. Let's kind of talk through some of those things. A lot of those things, they're not going to have kind of neat and tidy. Oh no, you're misreading that. That's not what happened. No, there's some disturbing things that happen in these books, in these two books here. But you're not the first one to notice it. You're not the first one to be troubled by it. You're not the first one to struggle with these things. So just if you're really wrestling with some of these things, come and talk to us. Or if you're at a different church, go and talk to your pastors, and just kind of with humility, with faith, have those conversations, and just know that you're not the first to be just concerned with some things that you find in these books. Second, and there's kind of two different flavors to I'm speaking fairly generally because there's two different things going on in these two books. So for instance, in Judges, you're going to see a lot of kind of the heroes, or a lot of the main characters at the very least, doing some disturbing things, doing some wicked and some evil things, without much commentary, where the Bible doesn't specifically say, oh, hey, this was a bad thing that guy just did. There's a few things going on there. I mean, the first one is simply just literary style. In our kind of modern narrative, we often expect narratives to kind of spoon feed us who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, what's good, what's bad. So someone does something bad in a book, and you expect there to be some kind of very clear clarification of, and it was an evil thing to do. That was a wicked thing to do. But the Bible is gonna basically expect you to have read the previous books and carefully enough to recognize, oh, when this Levite is serving at an idolatrous temple, or at an idol, when this Levite is serving at an idol, that's bad, right? You can see the book just kind of expects you to know that. So don't expect a ton of kind of commentary to give some color commentary on some of the really messed up things that you're going to see in these books. And so that's a part of the Bible. What's happening there basically is that you're seeing. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit. Basically, what you're seeing there is that in this period of history, the people of God just weren't living faithfully, and so they were descending into more and more moral chaos. And so what's happening here is the Bible isn't holding these things up as moral exemplars, or even just kind of like, hey, this is normal, this is kind of what's happening. It's holding them up specifically to show the growing faithlessness, the growing disobedience of God's covenant people. But then on the other side, with Joshua, it's not so much people doing wicked things, so much as seeing God's judgment in very strong terms, seeing God's judgment, not just on wicked people, but on wicked nations, on wicked kingdoms. And so that's just a hard reality to really chew on, especially in basically a humanistic age like ours, where kind of the default assumption is that humans are basically good, that mankind is basically good, kind of underneath it all. We're all basically good. We just kind of make some mistakes every now and then. And that's just not the picture that the Bible paints of human nature. That's just not the picture the Bible paints I should say, fallen human nature. And so we see that coming to the surface in the book of in the book of Joshua here, where God is pronouncing and calling for and requiring that Israel execute pretty stern judgment on these nations. And so that's hard to see. It's just hard for us to grapple with, to see judgment like this falling on these people. And so there's a little more that could be said to that, but just recognize that you're not the first one to read that and think that this is challenging. This is a stern view of God's holiness and God's judgment, that quite frankly we're just not versed in engaging with. We just don't grapple with, and quite frankly our age is just so unserious, and it's such a small view of the fear of the Lord, that even among Christians, even among those who believe in Jesus Christ, who confess their need for a Savior, there tends to be this difficulty in seeing God as this holy, and seeing sin as this severe, and seeing God's judgment as righteous. So even in that, a couple of pillars that I would point you to, that I would just encourage you to kind of hold on to, are basically these two biblical anchors that you just need to have in your mind. The first comes out of Psalm 145:17. Psalm 145:17 says, "The Lord is righteous in all his ways and kind in all his works." So everything that God does is righteous. That God has never done, has never commanded, has never willed anything unrighteous. Everything that God does is righteous. So that's obviously something that's going to that we're going to struggle with if we have a low view of human sinfulness. If we have a low view of God's holiness and the penalty of our sin, we're going to struggle with seeing God executing such stern judgment. So the first pillar, the first anchor we just need to hold on to, is God's absolute righteousness. He has never done anything even slightly unrighteous. And the second is God's wisdom. Out of Romans 11:33 through 35. "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid?" So as God's righteousness, everything God has ever done is righteous. Everything God will ever do is righteous, is good, is just. But on the other side, God is wise. Every decision God's ever made, every thought God's ever had is wise and far beyond our wisdom. So when we struggle to wrestle with, how is this wise, how is this right, how is this appropriate, at some point we need to just put our hand over our mouth and say, I am not as wise as God. I am not as knowledgeable as God. I am not as all-considering as God. God is righteous and God is wise. And so with that in mind, that doesn't make Joshua kind of easy to stomach. It doesn't make some of the things that we see there not hard, and yet it should give us enough humility to say, I just am not God. I just am not a high enough pay grade to make the kind of judgments that I'm thinking about making. That this God who is doing these things is just and he is wise. And at that, we just have to rest at that. Okay, well, let's go ahead and jump into these books. First up, Joshua. I'm just going to walk through, like I've been doing, structure, and then theology and redemption and application, all the rest there. So let's jump into the structure. So Joshua, kind of the high level, maybe subtitle you could give to Joshua, basically just this, or the main point is that we see God here fulfilling his promise through a faithful people. In Joshua, we see that God fulfills his promises through a faithful people. Specifically in Joshua, we see kind of the fulfillment of basically stage 2 of that threefold promise that I was talking about a few minutes ago, of a great nation, the land, and worldwide blessing. So the great nation has already been fulfilled as people multiplied in Egypt. But then here we see the fulfillment of the second stage, that God gives them, gives the people the land. So Joshua can basically be broken up into more or less four sections that really can be defined by kind of a key word that each section uses. So chapters 1 through 5, the key word there is basically enter, from the Hebrew habar, which just means kind of like pass over into, enter into, more or less. So here is just repeatedly we're seeing these commands, these instructions to enter the land, and how they are preparing to enter the land. So they cross the river and they enter the land in the first 5 chapters. In chapter 3, we see basically a miraculous kind of echo of the crossing of the Red Sea, where God parts the Jordan River so that Israel can, or I guess, stops the Jordan River for a little bit and piles it up so that the people can cross the river on dry land into the land. Then the second part is chapters 6 through 11. Chapters 6 through 11. The key word there is take the land, from the Hebrew lakah, which means take. So basically, in chapters 6, 7, and 8, we kind of see a zoomed in narrative of what's happening there, to basically spell out how this conquest is going to happen, how the people of Israel are going to take the land from the Canaanite inhabitants. Chapter 6, we see the Battle of Jericho. This is a famous battle where a city has these great impressive walls, and God commands the people of Israel basically to take their instruments and march the band around the city. And at the end of it, they shout, and the walls fall. God through that faithfulness, God makes the walls to fall. The kind of the main point of all of this is basically just showing that the conquest that we're about to see is not because of Israel's great strength and great strategy, but because simply of God's power. Because of God's power exercised in and through their faithfulness. In and through their faithfulness, even when it looks hopeless. Then chapter 7 shows us kind of the inverse of that, of the failure of Israel to take the city of Ai. The failure of the Israelite people to take the city of Ai. And it turns out the reason that they failed is because one man decided to keep some spoil from the conquest of Jericho that he should not have taken. That one man in the nation was unfaithful to God's commands, and so they failed in their attack on Ai. So they punish this man, they execute him, and they remove him from the community, and then the nation is faithful and is victorious at Ai. And so again, we're seeing this emphasis of that the final cause, the final reason for the covenant people's success or failure is not strategy, it's not circumstances, it's not what's going on around them. It's, are they going to be faithful to the Lord or not? If they're faithful, God will bless them, they'll prosper. If they're unfaithful, God will curse them, they will not prosper, they will be defeated. This is kind of the lesson that we see getting laid out in these 6, 7, and 8. Then chapters 10 and 11 basically, or I guess 9, 10, 11 basically zoom out, and we see basically the rest of the land being conquered. And interestingly, they conquer it through the armies coming to attack them. So in chapter 10, we see the southern kings, they kind of rally together and they go and attack Israel, the people of Israel, and yet they are defeated because God defeats them. And then chapter 11, we see the northern kings, they get together, they come and attack Israel and are defeated as well. And so that's the section 2, the take the land section. Then chapters 12 through 21, the key word there is divide, from the Hebrew halak, divide the land. Where basically we see the land getting apportioned out, that the land is being divided to the various tribes and sub-tribes of the people. Then chapters 22 through 24, the key word there is serve, from chabad, serve the Lord in the land. And we see basically just, some more instructions and details on what it's going to look like, what's going to be required of them to faithfully serve the Lord there in the land. Okay, so that is Joshua. Then for Judges, the structure here, basically you can think of it like the cyclical descent, kind of like a downward spiral, a cyclical descent into paganism and idolatry. A cyclical descent into paganism and idolatry. Basically what we see here is after the fulfillment of stage 1, Abraham becoming a great nation in Exodus, after the fulfillment of stage 2, God giving this nation the land of Israel in the book of Joshua. Here in Judges, we see a failure, or at least kind of the non-fulfillment of stage 3, of bringing about this worldwide blessing. And again, not because God was not powerful or God was not willing, but because the people were not faithful, because the people did not serve him with a whole heart. So again, I kind of mentioned this earlier. Is it somewhat hard to kind of catch everything that you need to catch to really get the thrust of what's happening here in this book? There's some details that the author is just kind of going to assume that you're going to know what to do with. Towns are going to be mentioned that you just kind of need expected to know what the significance of them are. A lot other certain details are going to pop up of someone doing something or not doing something that you should just kind of be familiar with from the Pentateuch to recognize as good or as bad. And so there's just a lot of stuff in here that it's going to require just kind of a faithful internalizing of the rest of the Old Testament to be able to kind of really understand what exactly is trying to be, what the book of Judges is trying to say to you in any given moment. I'll try to point out a few of those situations, but they're just it assumes you're just going to be very familiar with the Pentateuch as you read this book. So structure here. Really, chapter 1 and the first 5 verses of chapter 2 really just kind of set up, pick up the story where we left off, kind of setting us up where we left off, really just pointing to really the incomplete conquest of the land, really pointing to how the people of Israel did not completely fulfill the conquest as the Lord had told them to in the book of Joshua. And then in chapter 2, 6 through 11, 2, 6 through 11, basically we see kind of the trajectory of the book spelled out. We see kind of here is where this book is going to go, and really just sets it up basically by saying that after Joshua and kind of the men from his generation, the generation of leaders around Joshua, after they had all died, basically what we see immediately is that the next generation just is not faithful. The next generation just is not faithful to the Lord. The people were faithful to the Lord as long as they had Joshua, as long as they had this generation of faithful leaders. But as soon as they left the scene, the next generation was not faithful. So then chapters 3 through 21, basically the rest of the book, what we're going to see is that downward spiral into paganism. That downward, the downward spiral into paganism and idolatry. So one of the kind of major refrains that you're going to see, a common phrase repeated over and over, especially in these first 13 chapters, is the sentence, "Israel did what is evil in the eyes of the Lord." Israel did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. You see that in chapter 2, verse 11. You see that in chapter 3, verse 7 and verse 12. You see that in chapter 4, verse 1, chapter 6, verse 1, chapter 10, verse 6, and chapter 13, verse 1. Israel did. The story repeats back to this point over and over. Israel did what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. So as you're reading this book and seeing kind of progressively weirder and darker stories happening, just understand that that's the point. You're supposed to be seeing this progressively darker nation. So we see this mostly through, especially in the first kind of half of this section, maybe more than that, basically through seeing these judges who are progressively less virtuous, less godly, and more ungodly, more wicked. So chapter 3, we see basically a series of kind of uncomplicated good guys. It's just men who, this guy was the judge, this guy saved Israel. Things were great for a little while. We see Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, not really much commentary on them, just they saved Israel. They were some good faithful guys. Under them, the people were faithful, and they rescued the land. Then chapters 4 through 16, basically we see kind of these progressively more compromised leaders, right? It's kind of you see this kind of growing inadequacy, growing ungodliness in these leaders. So first off, we see a judge named Barak, and he's okay, he's fine, he's really he's good, but he's not quite as courageous as he should be. He's not quite as brave as he should be. Then we see Gideon, and he's, I mean, quite frankly, there's a lot of stuff where it seems he's presenting him just as quite cowardly. So he's told to go destroy this idol, and he kind of waits till midnight when nobody's around. He kind of goes and does it in the dark of the night. Okay, he did the thing. That's great. I mean, he's not. He's much better than the judges that come later on, but we see this kind of cowardliness. We see he's just repeatedly asking the Lord to prove himself, repeatedly asking the Lord to confirm what he's saying to him. And then it gets even worse than that. So he leads, after he has delivered the people, he actually leads them to mostly faithfulness, but actually leads them into indulging in certain forms of idolatry. You see this in chapter 8, verse 27. And what's important here is this isn't a first commandment kind of idolatry. This isn't a false gods kind of idolatry, but this is a second commandment kind of idolatry. This is a worshiping the right God, but in idolatrous means, in idolatrous ways. Kind of idolatry, right? So he doesn't go and lead them to worship the gods of the nations, but he leads them to worship the true God through an idolatrous means, through an idolatrous way. And then, interestingly, he sets himself up as he kind of refuses to be called the king directly, but then you see this kind of interesting detail in how he decides to name his son. So names in the Bible are much more significant than names to most of us these days. But sometimes you just kind of need to translate the name to kind of see what's going on there. So Gideon, he refuses to be called the king of Israel, to be set up as the king of Israel, but then he names his son Abimelech. He names his son Abimelech, which in Hebrew just means my father is king. My father is king, which is quite the name to give to your own son. So this is something that Gideon is kind of setting himself up as more than he is supposed to be. And then this Abimelech, the son of Gideon, is just dark. He is just wicked. So he's not a judge himself, but he's the son of a judge, and so you see some compromise starting to come up there. Then we see in chapter 10, verses 1 through 5, another couple of judges are listed without really much commentary. Tola and Jair, don't see really anything about them, so maybe they're still kind of uncomplicated good guys. We just aren't told very much. And then we see in 11 and 12 the judge named Jephthah. So he makes a foolish pagan vow with wicked consequences. And so he is someone who basically is almost indistinguishable from a pagan leader. And then we see Judges 12, 8 through 15. We see guys named Ibzan, Elon, Abdon. And again, there's not a lot mentioned about them, except for the fact that I think either between them or each of them had 30 sons. These guys had 30 sons. So there's not really a lot listed about those, but at the very least, you can kind of understand that these aren't exactly husband of one woman kind of guys. So we just continue to see this kind of declining virtue in some of these judges. So then we get to 13 through 16, and we see the story of Samson. We see the story of Samson, who basically is held up as strong and as fighting these battles for the Lord, but just as foolish and just with this strong lust for foreign women and foreign wives, which ultimately leads to his destruction. And in a lot of ways, some will argue, and I think that there's good reason for this, that basically Samson and his adultery or just sexual immorality is basically kind of being held up at this point in the story to kind of point to and be a mirror image to Israel's idolatry. Throughout the Old Testament, idolatry, the Lord talks about idolatry as spiritual adultery. Idolatry as this spiritual covenant unfaithfulness. And so Samson, indulging in sexual immorality, indulging in adultery, indulging in the pursuit of foreign wives, is being held up basically as an example, as a mirror to Israel, saying, this is what you're doing with foreign gods. This is what you're doing with other gods and foreign gods and all those bad things. So we see these judges who still they save Israel. They're faithful to the Lord. They fight the Lord's battles, and yet we see this kind of downward spiral into destruction. And interestingly, I think there's in some of them, I think especially in Samson, you do start to see kind of an ethic of repentance, an ethic of turning back to the Lord. One thing that I think is just really suggestive is so at the end of the story of Samson, he gets captured by the Philistines, the enemies of God. He gets taken to basically one of their parties, and he's chained up to a couple of pillars to mock him and all those things. And he prays to the Lord to give him strength to fight his enemies one more time. And it says that in that moment he bowed with all his might, and pushed over the columns and knocked over the building and took out all the bad guys. But it's just this interestingly suggestive imagery of bowing with all his might, just suggesting this like faithful repentance to the Lord that I think it's just suggestive. It's just kind of sitting there. But I think it's just this sweet, even early introduction of just this ethic of turning from foolishness to faithfulness. So, and this is where, at this stage in the book, basically up to this point, these guys, they're all still held up as heroes, as basically the good guys that delivered the people of Israel. But they're obviously compromised, and there's this kind of this downward trajectory, basically a movement where at the beginning it's the faithful men of God delivering the people of God to be faithful to God, and by the end it's kind of these just kind of confused, semi-faithful, semi-pagan, just confused guys saving a confused people to basically be confused. So it gets muddy, and that's a part of the point. So you have that recurring refrain that we saw earlier. Israel did what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. Then you get this new refrain at this point in chapter 17, where twice here and then later we see this line that everyone did what was right in his own eyes. We see that in 17 verse 6 and 21 verse 25. And we see another refrain pick up as well in 17 verse 6 as well. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel." So it's just get an explanation of why everyone was doing what was right in his own eyes. There, in those days there was no king in Israel. We see that in 17 verse 6, 18 verse 1, 19 verse 1, and 21 verse 25 as well. And basically, here's where it kind of goes from like this descent into more confusion and darkness into just rampant wickedness, into just dark corruption. It's just dark from here to the end of the book. So in chapter 17, we see the story of Micah and a Levite. And it's just this weird story of this guy named Micah who basically he steals some silver from his mom, and then he turns it into an idol, and then he hires one of Moses's great grandsons to be a priest to this idol. It's just this odd story that just kind of, it doesn't really accomplish anything other than saying, hey, things are messed up. Especially the note just of this guy being Moses's great grandson. It's just such a it just shows how bad things have gotten. But just think about how many of the Ten Commandments we see being violated there. So he steals some silver, so that's eighth commandment violation, right, from his mom. So there's extra fifth commandment violation turned right there, and then turns it into an idol. So there's at the very least a second commandment violation, if not a first commandment violation as well. And so you just see in just these little stories all kinds of pointers back to how the Pentateuch is getting mangled and broken here. And then you see 19 to 21, another Levite, a different Levite. Again, just remember that it's interesting that both of these stories involve Levites. So Levites are supposed to be the priest tribe. They're supposed to be the tribe who is teaching Israel how to live and follow God's law. And yet we see here in the darkest chapters of the book of Judges, this is where the Levites come in to just be corrupt, to just be leading the people into dark directions. So there's this Levite, basically he has a concubine and he goes and he's traveling, and while he's traveling, his concubine gets killed, and that's even darker than that, but his concubine gets killed. And so then basically at this town called Gibeah, which again is the town, or not again, but this is the town where King Saul is from, so that should kind of be triggering some thoughts for you, or at least that should be, when we get to King Saul, that should trigger some thoughts back to this town. So so this Levite basically sends messages to the rest of the nation saying, "Hey, these guys, you killed my concubine. We should come and avenge her and be avenged on this town." And so then the rest of Israel basically wages war on this town and on Benjamin, the tribe that this town is a part of. Which then leads to Benjamin getting very, diminished in number, and they're all of a sudden worried about, well, man, what do we don't want Benjamin to be totally destroyed, so we need to find them some wives, but we have the rest of Israel, we've sworn an oath to not give them any of our daughters, and so how are we going to find daughters for these Benjamites? Well, let's go to Shiloh. Which again, it doesn't explicitly get laid out, but so Shiloh is where the tabernacle was at that point. This is where the Ark of the Covenant is. This is where this is the seat of God's name. This is kind of like Jerusalem before Jerusalem was Jerusalem. So as I said, let's go to Shiloh, and while they're having a festival to the Lord, well, we're going to kind of sneak up on them and kidnap a bunch of women and give them to the Benjaminites as wives. And so you read that and you just go, there are no good guys in that story. There is no good guy in that story. There's some victims, but there's no good guys in anywhere in that story. And you just see the unfaithfulness just rippling through this book. And that's the point. That's what you're supposed to see, is that without Joshua, without the virtuous judges, and before there were any kings in the land, remember in those days there was no king in Israel, before the king, the people were descending into wickedness, into paganism, into idolatry. Israel has become a nation of wicked pagans because they do not have a king. That's the point of what you should be seeing in Judges. So what are some just points of theology to tease out? So first, for Joshua, would you see that God fulfills His promise, that God is faithful to His promises, that He works out His promises in His own time, in His own way. We see this in the battle plan for Jericho. This isn't good military strategy. This is God fulfilling His promises. We see this in how God gives His people victory over much more powerful armies, over massive armies that were lined up against them. Joshua 10:42, after the conquest of this coalition of kings, Joshua 10:42 says, "And Joshua captured all these kings and their land at one time, because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel." Right. So Joshua is successful not because he's wise, not because he's great, but because the Lord fought for them. We also see, so God fulfills His promises. We also see that God takes sin deadly seriously. That God takes sin deadly seriously. So we see this in the judgment on the Canaanites. And so we just see the seriousness there of God's judgment, of God's holiness, and of human sin. So God fulfills His promises, and God takes sin deadly seriously. Then in Judges, basically we just see kind of one simple idea. To be a faithful people, Israel needs a faithful king. To be a faithful people, Israel needs a faithful king. Tom Schreiner, in his book, The King in His Beauty, makes this comment. He says, just kind of overviewing the whole book of Judges, says, "A new generation dawns with the book of Judges. On the heels of the book of Joshua, we wonder if Israel will be faithful to the covenant that was reaffirmed at the conclusion of Joshua. For it is clear that Israel will prosper only if they obey their covenant Lord and King. 2/3 of the promise made with Abraham had been fulfilled. Israel enjoyed a large population, and they inhabited the land of Canaan. But would they bless the whole world? Would the universal blessing promised to Abraham become a reality through them?" The book of Judges dashes any hopes that worldwide blessing would come anytime soon through Israel. Yeah, I appreciate that quote. Again, it just makes, it highlights that kind of threefold promise thing, and again emphasizes that the first two have been accomplished: the population, the land, check, check. But are the people of Israel going to be this worldwide blessing or not? Judges would suggest that not anytime soon. Not anytime soon. And we see that really through those repeated refrains that we saw earlier. Israel did what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times in the book of Judges. And everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's 2 more times in the book of Judges. And then 1, 2, 3, 4 times we see, in those days there was no king in Israel. So the problem is that Israel was doing what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. Israel was doing kind of whatever they felt like made the most sense to them. They were living their truth. They were following their heart. They were doing all those things, and it was all wicked in the eyes of the Lord. Why? Because they didn't have a king. Because they didn't have a king. Okay, so redemption. What do we see about redemption? Basically, both of these are basically a study in faithfulness versus unfaithfulness. A study in faithfulness versus unfaithfulness. And what makes the difference? What causes the people to be faithful or unfaithful? At the end of the day, it comes down to the king. Is there going to be a Joshua to lead the people into faithfulness or no? Is there going to be a king, a faithful king, to lead the people into faithfulness or no? So Israel will be blessed insofar as they are faithful, and they will be faithful insofar as they have a good king, and they will have a good king insofar as he is yielded to the Lord. So redemption. One thing to note that's interesting, Joshua has the same name as Jesus. Joshua has the same name as Jesus. Both, so Joshua is kind of the English version, and Jesus is basically the Greek version, but both come from the Hebrew Yeshua. So they both kind of have the same root name. So there's this connection that Jesus makes in Matthew chapter 11, where so for Joshua, throughout the book of Joshua, you start to see you see consistently this picture that what God describes giving them the land, he describes it as giving them rest in the land. That through Joshua, God is going to give them rest in the land. And then Jesus touches on this in Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30, where he says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I will give you rest. What Joshua was a symbol of is this picture of God through his chosen champion, through Jesus Christ, giving his people rest, giving his people rest. So then Judges kind of redemptively basically just sets up the need for a king, right? We've hit that already, but just sets up the need for a king. He just sets up this need, not just for a king, but for a redeemer king. A redeemer king is going to lead Israel into faithfulness and to bring about this worldwide blessing, which sets up Samuel and Kings, which sets up the next couple of books that we will jump into next time. So here's the kind of the big question at the end of Judges. How will this Abrahamic promise be fully fulfilled? How will this global blessing come through this people? Okay, so for application, there's really just kind of one observation I want to point out for you. One thing I just want you to notice. So throughout Judges, we see we see a few righteous men, we see several wicked men, and we see a lot of kind of compromised but faithful men. We see a lot of imperfect and compromised and inconsistent yet faithful men. And I think that there's something that we need to wrestle with is that in the book of Judges we see Gideon, who sets up idolatry. We see Barak, who's unwilling to fight the battle unless Deborah comes with him. We see Samson, who just indulges in sexual immorality and foolishness. We see Jephthah, who sacrifices his daughter because of a pagan and foolish vow. We see all of these men. And the book of Hebrews, interestingly, mentions all of them. The book of Hebrews in chapter 11 mentions all of them. And if you're familiar with it, chapter 11 of Hebrews is often called the Hall of Faith, where the author of Hebrews just walks through several heroes from the Old Testament and lifts up kind of their faith and how all that they accomplished through their faith, all the Lord accomplished through their faith through the Old Testament. And he gets to these men. And he doesn't go into detail with them, but he mentions each of them as heroes of the faith. And so I think that needs to condition the way that we see these men. And that needs to condition the way that we think about really anyone. The way that we judge ourselves, that we judge others, that we just think about our own inconsistencies and the inconsistencies of others around us. Where we kind of have this tendency where we want to kind of cancel out all the good. We want to cancel out faithfulness. We want to cancel out good in others, whether it's or ourselves or others, our contemporaries or historic figures. We tend to have this desire to almost want to cancel out their good because of their bad. We want to cancel out anything faithful that they've done because of any wicked thing that we want to condemn. But what the scriptures seem to want to do is to say that through faith, your sin is canceled out. That through faith, your failure is canceled out. That through faith, your wickedness, your inconsistency, your inability, your shortcomings are canceled out. And where you are remembered in the book of God is as and for your faith. So even as we see in these men, these stories, these lives, basically examples of how Israel is kind of spiraling down into unfaithfulness, we need to condition that with the redeeming power of Jesus Christ, with the redeeming power of what Jesus has done even for these men. Even in spite of their foolishness, their shortcoming, their kind of unfaithfulness, in their faith, in their zeal to serve the Lord and to live for his kingdom, the Lord honors them for their faith. Well, that's all I have for these two books. Hopefully this is helpful and a blessing. Hopefully this is encouraging. And hopefully, again, this would send you not to skip these books, but to go in and kind of dive a little bit deeper to see what you can get in and from these books. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord encourage you. And may his word be a lamp to your feet and a light to your path.